May the 9th, 2021, on Red Square in Moscow. In front of his army marching in close ranks, Vladimir Putin announces a quasi-declaration of war.
We will firmly defend our national interests and ensure the security of our people with our glorious Russian army.
As every year, Russia celebrates its victory over the Nazis in the Second World War.
Almost a century ago, the abominable Nazi beast began to spread its predatory force over Central Europe. This enemy did not only want to destroy the Soviet political system, it also wanted to destroy our state, our nation, and eradicate our people.
On that day, 9 months before the invasion of Ukraine, his speech was not just a historical tribute. The Russian president openly declared the threat of a Nazi enemy at the gates of Russia.
Unfortunately, some people today are trying to redeploy the Nazi ideology. We are witnessing new members of these killer squads trying to rewrite history and justify from the actions of traitors and criminals whose hands are red, with the blood of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Our people know too well how this is likely to end.
A few months later, the Russian president deployed his troops to the Ukrainian border. On February the 24th, 2022, he shook the entire planet.
I have made a decision to conduct a special military operation. Its purpose is to protect people who have been subjected to abuse and genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. We will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.
The world is witnessing the rise of a hostile dictator, one that has already led many wars. In Chechnya in the 2000s, he laid waste to Grozny.
There are political reasons for the larger-scale bombing of civilians. He wanted the population to be punished for rebelling, and today, according to the Kremlin, Ukrainians must be punished for resisting the brute force of the Russian Federation.
A few years later, Putin invaded Georgia, and in 2014, he already attacked Ukraine by annexing the Crimean Peninsula and the eastern part of the country, the Donbass.
Vladimir Putin has long believed that the existence of a democratic state on Russia's border is a serious threat to him and an eternal temptation for the Russian people.
The Russian army even ventured into the Middle East. In 2015, Vladimir Putin showed support for the dictator Bashar al-Assad in Syria and bombed thousands of civilians.
By supporting Bashar al-Assad, he showed the world, in particular in the Middle East, that Russia does not abandon its friends.
Putin intends to restore Russia's former glory.
He is an imperialist and he is nostalgic of Russia's status as a superpower.
To reinstate Russia, he imposes a permanent power struggle.
He does not negotiate with his power, he ruthlessly imposes it. He does the only thing he knows how to do, like a child who doesn't get their way, he acts out.
In the Kremlin, he exercises power as if a monarch.
And he maintains the idea that he is the father of the nation as Stalin was the father of the people.
At a time when the Russian army is present in Ukraine, the nuclear option is ever more on the table.
What he is doing is extremely rational. The use of strategic nuclear weapons by Vladimir Putin must be considered as a possible scenario. You must understand that. It is very dangerous for the whole world. You have to imagine that Putin is Saddam Hussein with nuclear weapons. A disaster will follow.
2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the USSR officially dissolved. In 1991, under the presidency of Boris Yeltsin, Russia was led down a path of suffering. The country declined, undermined by corruption and struck by poverty. But at the turn of the millennium, one man tried to reverse the situation. To everyone's surprise, Boris Yeltsin chose an unknown man as his successor, the head of the FSB, the Russian intelligence services.
In a television speech, the Russian president clearly designated Vladimir Putin as his successor. Vladimir Putin was not well known. Russia thought of him then as a tough man who would restore order in Chechnya.
At the time, Russia was facing an independence rebellion in Chechnya. This region of the Caucasus has been trying to secede for 10 years. Chechen soldiers didn't hesitate to attack on Russian soil. In the summer of 1999, Moscow and other major cities were hit by a series of explosions that killed over 300 people. Vladimir Putin's response was nothing short of ruthless. At a press conference in September 1999, the head of the Kremlin did not mince his words.
If they are in an airport, we will look for them in the airport. And if necessary, we will shoot them in the toilet.
Putin stayed true to his word and sent 140,000 Russian soldiers to crush the rebels.
The message is clear. The offensive of the Russian forces against the Islamist rebels in Chechnya will be in full swing. When President Vladimir Putin came to power, he ordered the Russian army to get the desired results at any cost. And exactly the same thing is happening in Ukraine today. The behavior of Vladimir Putin during the Second Chechen War is a behavior that absolutely allows extreme violence from the first days of the war.
Putin ordered the bombing of the capital. With almost no resistance from the international community, he demolished Grozny. More than 80% of the city was destroyed. Thousands of civilians were killed.
It was an indiscriminate violence against civilians and a desire to show that the Russian army is becoming powerful again. There are political reasons for the larger-scale bombing of civilians. It was necessary to punish the population for rebelling. It was necessary to punish the Chechens for rebelling, for trying to leave the Russian Federation. And today, according to the Kremlin, the Ukrainians must be punished not only deeper, for wanting to exist politically, for having the framework of a viable democracy, for pushing the European project of looking towards the West, and it is also necessary to punish them for resisting the brute force of the Russian Federation.
Once the desire for independence was stifled, Vladimir Putin placed a man he trusted at the head of the small Caucasian republic, Ramzan Kadyrov.
I have made a decision to propose your candidacy as President of Chechnya. Thank you for the confidence you have placed in me. There is a turnaround of a part of the Chechen independentists who have since held power in the Republic of North Caucasus. Ramzan Kadyrov owes his power to Moscow, so he has an allegiance that is very clear, which is integral.
In a few years, with the support of the Kremlin, Ramzan Kadyrov imposed his authoritarian and mafia-like regime. His supporters kept an eye on the last uncooperative rebels. Like his mentor, the young Chechen leader cultivated a cult of virility and violence, and he didn't hesitate to show off. Putin tackled a tiger. Kadyrov wrestled a crocodile. And when the Russian president defeated his opponents with judo holds, his Chechen henchmen settled disagreements with his own ministers in a boxing ring.
2 раунда, нокаута не случилось.
Always ready to serve his boss and benefactor, Kadyrov proved his allegiance more and more every day.
It's a relationship of very strong loyalty. Besides, we know that Kadyrov refused the title of President of the Chechen Republic, saying that there could only be one president. He never misses an opportunity to say, "Glory to Russia," or "There can be only one president." He is eternally indebted and loyal to Vladimir Putin.
From the first hours of the war in Ukraine, the Chechen leader offered military assistance to the Russian regime with high-budget propaganda videos. Kadyrov announced the send-off of his elite troops to the world and threatened President Zelenskyy.
I would like to give a piece of advice to President Zelenskyy, who is still in power, early for the time being, before he becomes an ex-president. He should quickly call our President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and take a step to save Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, accept all the conditions that Russia demands, actually, and apologize for not having taken this step earlier.
Their staging was cleverly constructed, modelled on that of the Islamic State, sinister fighters dressed in black, rushing to attack Ukraine. The image is striking.
Chechen troops are well armed, and in the videos, we can see that their equipment and weapons are sometimes even better than those of Russian soldiers.
But the reality is somewhat different.
These Chechen forces are not very experienced, so they cultivate the image of a very powerful force with very muscular fighters who often practice MMA, and very clearly, this is one of the reasons why they were deployed in Ukraine. But the reality of combat is quite different. Some military analysts say that it is more of a psychological warfare strategy, looking to scare the opponent rather than a tactical warfare reality.
According to his latest social media posts, Kadyrov has joined his men in Ukraine to assist the invasion launched by Vladimir Putin. Ramzan Kadyrov also executes Putin's dirty work. He is suspected of facilitating the assassination of Russian opponent Boris Nemtsov.
After 11 o'clock last night, he was shot 4 times in the back in the shadow of the Kremlin. The crime was a bold one. The scene is monitored by police and cameras.
Vladimir Putin, the former KGB agent, does not hesitate to eliminate opponents such as Boris Nemtsov, even when they are abroad. Like here in London, Marina Litvinenko has been living in exile for 22 years.
I've never been back to Russia since 2000, but I'm still to believe one day I'll be back to Russia, without Putin and without Putinism.
Her husband, Alexander Litvinenko, worked for the FSB for a long time before becoming a fervent opponent of the Russian president. On November 1st, 2006, he went to this London palace to meet with 2 Russian businessmen.
Radioactive polonium was put to the teapot, and Sasha had a few sips of this tea, and he started to feel very bad only in a few hours.
The former spy died 20 days later in the hospital in excruciating pain.
From very first day, it was absolutely torture. He was in a constant pain. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink. When I came to see him in hospital, it was like a different person, like older in 10 years, every day.
For Marina, the amount of polonium used left little doubt about who gave the orders.
It might be only it was very high level of our government of Russia, because amount of polonium was so big. You might take it only from nuclear reactor. You can't buy this from black market, you can't buy in a pharmacy, you can't exchange with, you can't. I believe for what my husband say in his last statement, He's pointed directly Putin for killing him.
Andrei Lugovoy, the FSB spy who allegedly poisoned Marina's husband, became a member of the Russian parliament a year later. In 2015, he was even celebrated by the Order of Vladimir Putin for services to the nation.
It was from very early stage shown this regime is preparing to do everything and don't hesitate to use radioactive material, to kill people, to destroy cities, to start a war.
These targeted assassinations are a trademark of the Kremlin. A few months before Alexander Litvinenko, the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who denounced Russian abuses in Chechnya, was shot dead in her home in Moscow.
Her death is a tragedy for all of us Russian journalists. It makes it clear that we are not free to speak and write openly.
In 2018, again in Great Britain, Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military agent, was poisoned with Novichok, a nerve agent that attacks the nervous system, also administered in August of 2020 to Alexei Navalny, an opposition figure in Russia. His screams of pain. Unconscious on a stretcher, one of Vladimir Putin's main opponents balances between life and death. Treated in a German hospital, Navalny miraculously survived. For Vladimir Milov, whose relative is now exiled in Lithuania, the use of this poison is a signature.
Novichok is very difficult to identify, so they had bet on the fact that it passes for a natural death, like a heart attack, so that we don't suspect Russia.
A few weeks later, with journalists from the investigative website Bellingcat, Alexei Navalny managed to find a member of the FSB commando responsible for poisoning him.
Konstantin. Алло, Konstantin Борисович.
He pretends to be one of the supporters reporting on the failure of the mission.
I got your call from Vladimir Mikhailovich Bogdanov. Sorry for the early call. I need 10 minutes of your time.
After several minutes of conversation, Navalny gets crucial information.
Yes, it's possible. The flight could have been longer. If the plane had not landed in a hurry like that, everything would have happened differently. They miscalculated the dosage. Why? I couldn't tell you why. We calculated everything with a margin of error.
Vladimir Milov directly accuses Putin.
Of course it was Putin who poisoned Navalny because in Russia, no one other than Navalny poses a problem for Putin personally. Bellingcat journalists have identified the perpetrators responsible for poisoning Navalny. It is also known that in the hotel where Navalny was poisoned in Tomsk, the videos, well, from the surveillance cameras were recovered, and according to the hotel staff, in 2 days before the poisoning, new unknown security guards replaced the old ones.
Despite compelling evidence, Putin denied any Russian state involvement at a press conference in December of 2020.
This is not a journalistic investigation. The so-called evidence was provided by the American Secret Service. If we had wanted, the case would have been carried out to its conclusion.
Once recovered, despite the risks, Navalny returned to Russia. He was questioned upon arrival at the airport.
Good luck, Alexei. We are with you.
He was then sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for a so-called fraud case. But 2 days after his arrest, Putin's sworn enemy took revenge. He published this video.
Hello, this is Navalny. We followed this investigation while I was in intensive care, and we decided that we would publish it when I returned home to Russia, to Moscow.
In the video, he revealed that Putin had this huge 17,000 square meter palace built for himself on the shores of the Black Sea. The estimated cost of this enormous project was over 1 billion euros.
Перейдем к интерьерам. Это, конечно, не просто здание, это символ 20 лет правления Путина. 20 лет у власти, репрессивные законы, обворованный нищий народ,
It's the symbol of 20 years of Putin's rule, the symbol of repressive laws and theft from the poor, of complete destruction of political life, of rewriting the constitution, of all the incarcerations. And all this for what? For gold and marble, for Louis XIV-style sofas, for mosaics, frescoes, a home cinema and an aqua disco. He tried to build a palace that surpassed all the palaces that the Tsars and emperors together had already built. Something that is bigger, more luxurious. But the result is in very bad taste. All this reflects a small-scale life, extremely tiny. In fact, he wants to prove to himself and others that he is a great historical figure.
But who really is Vladimir Putin? This man who built a palace worthy of the greatest emperors.
I am very pleased to welcome you today in the Kremlin.
Jean-Maurice Repère, French ambassador to Moscow between 2013 and 2017, met him several times.
Nous sommes invités chaque année au Kremlin, sur la colline.
We are invited every year to the Kremlin on the hill for a country party. Putin arrives and sits behind a table. It reminded me of the Middle Ages. Because it was a long table, there was the patriarch on his right, the prime minister on his left, facing the people. In front of the people, the oligarchs, the people who matter in Moscow, and the diplomats who were invited to watch President Putin eat. He maintains this idea that he is the father of the nation as Stalin was the father of the people.
Obsessed with the country's glorious past, Putin strives to be the supreme benefactor of Russia.
Every interview with Vladimir Putin began with a minimum of 20 minutes of historical reminders about the history of Russia. The history revisited in a kind of catachresis between the empire, the emperor of all Russia that he was in the process of becoming again, and the USSR of Joseph Stalin. Vladimir Putin has always been obsessed with the fall of the Soviet Union, and he said very soon after coming to power that it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century.
Boris Akunin, one of Russia's greatest writers, has been living in exile in London since 2014.
Putin acts very much like Nicholas I.
He fled his country worried by the authoritarian undertones of this new Tsar.
He is an imperialist who is nostalgic for the power Russia once had. I decided to leave Russia because I did not want to live in North Korea.
According to him, Vladimir Putin acts like a monarch, totally cut off from the realities of the world.
You have to understand that he is someone who does not even know how to use the internet. He is only informed by printed reports brought to him by his administration and the secret services. And those who bring him this information, they are so afraid of disappointing him that they only give him information that he likes.
Mikhail Tsigar, a Russian journalist who has investigated into the heart of the Kremlin, has also noted the danger of this ideological confinement.
The people who have been around Putin for a long time repeat the things that Putin told them, and they ended up believing it themselves. For example, the stories about the American conspiracy against Russia, about NATO, about the so-called Nazis in Ukraine. The image he has of the world is completely distorted. It's quite comical how it works. Putin has created a television propaganda machine so that it works exactly as he wants it to. And then he watches it over and over again and believes everything the machine tells him.
Putin strikes fear into the hearts of those around him. A terror evident at a Security Council meeting in the Kremlin on February the 21st, 2022. Sergei Naryshkin, Putin's foreign intelligence chief, was humiliated on live television.
You propose to recognize the independence of the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk? Just say it. I would support the proposal. You would support or you do support? Say it directly, Sergei. Just say it. Yes, yes, I support it. Yes. Well, thank you. Go back to your seat. They were there like school children in a classroom who have to recite a lesson to their teacher. Like school children who don't know the right answers, but who try to guess what the teacher wants to hear. That's why they were stuttering, shaking, and trying to recite the lesson while improvising. In fact, people have completely lost their critical thinking, their ability to think for themselves, because thinking has become dangerous.
Isolated, paranoid, cornered. Has President Putin lost all rationality? On February the 27th, in a chilling display surrounded by his chief of staff, Valery Gerasimov, and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, he brandished a nuclear threat.
I order the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff to put the deterrent forces of the Russian army on special combat alert.
A bluff, or is he capable of carrying out this threat?
Basically, even the use of strategic nuclear weapons by Vladimir Putin should be seen as a possible scenario. And what he is doing is extremely logical. The use of weapons against civilians is logical. Even the use of weapons of destruction would be logical. You have to understand that. I lent a rationality to Vladimir Putin that he obviously no longer has, because he has become purely and simply a dictatorial warlord. Everyone is persuaded that if there is a third world war, it will be nuclear. I would never have imagined in my lifetime that the world could face a nuclear threat after the collapse of the USSR. Today, I realize that this threat is real. Putin has nothing left to lose. He is already the most hated man on the planet. That's how a dictator's conscience works. Who cares what happens after me?
At what point did Vladimir Putin become so radicalized? In 2007, he was already showing signs of opposition to the West. That day, during a conference in Munich with the main heads of state, the Russian president attacked the United States.
What does a unipolar world mean? No matter how much you try to embellish the term, it really means only one thing. There is only one center of power, only one center of strength, only one center of decision-making. It is the world of one master, of one sovereign. To be a great power, especially for someone who was raised during and by the Cold War, it is necessary to be recognized as the privileged representative of the United States of the Americas. It is the enemy who, by negotiating with you, delivers you the certificate of great power.
In front of the German Chancellor and the American Secretary of State for Defense, Vladimir Putin denounced the New World gendarme.
We are witnessing a growing disregard for the fundamental principles of international law. Certain norms, indeed almost the entire legal system of a state, and first and foremost, of course, of the United States, have exceeded the limits in all areas. Whether in economics, politics, or humanitarianism, they have imposed themselves on all other states. Who could stand that? Who would put up with that? There, he turns the members' blood to ice by saying that there was a risk of a new Cold War. So it is really a kind of alarm signal at this moment for Westerners who say to themselves that they could consider Vladimir Putin as a quasi-ally at the beginning of the year 2000. He's experiencing a kind of process of internal radicalization.
Russia no longer intended to play second in command.
He explains to us that the policy of power is finally justified. He explains to us that he has the intention to redraw the international order. And I fear that this is still not understood today. And this is what he says to us in 2007. We will redraw. We will reintroduce the principle of the force since the Americans decided to do it. There is no reason why we shouldn't do it. We will do it, and you will see what you will see.
His words spoken in Munich were not empty. Only a few months later, Putin started another war. In the spring of 2008, he discovered that Georgia, a former Soviet republic, was getting closer to the United States.
Vladimir Putin has arrived in Bucharest this morning.
The Georgian authorities were even asked to join NATO. For the Russian president, that was a provocation.
This is unbearable for Vladimir Putin, and so he does the only thing he knows how to do. Like a child who doesn't get his way in the schoolyard, he acts out.
Putin was traumatized by the fall of the USSR and therefore sought to restore Russian influence in what he considered his territory, the so-called near abroad.
Near abroad means that the satellite countries, as they were called at the time, guaranteed the security of the USSR, especially at the time of the Cold War, of course. It was a bit like the buffer zone. So, for Vladimir Putin, he holds this idea very deeply that even if these states into MUN, who have become independent, are not in fact free nor independent.
In less than 10 days, Russian forces crushed the small Georgian army. At the end of the war, the Kremlin troops withdrew from the country, but not without annexing two Georgian territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Western heads of state protested, some gently.
The German position is that we should not cut the thread of dialogue, but that we should speak clearly with Russia.
Others showed more force.
This decision, which aims to unilaterally change Georgia's borders, is simply unacceptable.
But these declarations against Putin were not followed up. No sanctions were taken against Russia. The United States and Europe took a step back.
In 2008, we didn't really sanction Russia, and they ended up occupying Georgia, being an independent country, without any real justification. And so it's true that what we said to Russia throughout the 2000s, particularly at the end of the 2000s, we were more perceived as signs of weakness rather than signs of strength.
Vladimir Putin was now assured that Western leaders were weak, and he could easily impose his will on them.
He does not negotiate with his power, he imposes it. For him, the European states are not even actors in international relations.
Another event that persuaded Putin of the hypocrisy of the West was the death of Muammar Gaddafi. The Libyan leader had long been an ally of Western heads of state. He was even Nicolas Sarkozy's guest of honor, received with a great ceremony at the Élysée. But in 2011, Gaddafi was banned from the international community.
I'm sure that all the dictators of the world understand that in the 20th century, there is no place where they can escape their punishment.
France launched a war against its former ally. After a 2-month manhunt, the Guide of the Revolution was captured and lynched in the region of Sirte. Footage that Putin became obsessed by.
I can still see Vladimir Putin asking François Hollande the question, do you realize what you've done? You saw the footage of this head of state lynched on his tank, his bloody face. It also says a lot about Vladimir Putin's mind, this kind of paranoia that has developed little by little. It is true that dictators, like Putin, are always terrorized by the idea that their personal fate could end in a dramatic way.
The Arab Spring revolts in the Middle East ended up removing many autocrats from power, including the Tunisian President Ben Ali and the Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Vladimir Putin's fear of being removed from his throne grew stronger as this democratic contagion reached Russia's doorstep. In Ukraine, 2014, the Moscow allied president, Yanukovych, was overthrown by the Maidan Square revolution.
Vladimir Putin has long thought that the existence of a democratic state on the border, where people look a lot like Russians, is a serious threat to him. It is an eternal temptation for Russians. The turning point for him is obviously 2013-13-14 one with the protests on Maidan Square. We do not wave NATO flags, we wave flags of Europe, of the European Union. What scares Putin, in my opinion, at that moment is Ukraine, which may be moving away from Russia for good, at least for a few decades. It's the center of the sphere of influence that he would like to reconstitute.
Putin struck back and decided to annex Crimea, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian peninsula on the Black Sea.
He took that area and managed to avoid a conflict with a Ukrainian army that was not as organized, trained, and rearmed as it is today. So he took the world by surprise.
A referendum, not recognized by the international community, ratified the joining of Crimea to the Russian Federation. Vladimir Putin authorized the annexation treaty on March the 18th, 2014.
More than 96% of people voted for reunification with Russia. The figures speak for themselves. Despite this, what do we hear from our colleagues in Western Europe and North America? They say that we are violating the norms of international law. First of all, it's a good thing that they finally remember that international law exists. Better late than never.
La Crimée, c'est la rupture d'un tabou.
Crimea breaks a ban. The ban is on changing the borders by force in Europe. That is something that was supposed to end in 1945. And so the fact that he breaks this ban causes a major rupture in European order. And so the fact that he breaks this ban causes a major rupture in European order. It would have been necessary to declare war on Russia, which is well known to be difficult for democracies. Nobody likes war.
Europe and the United States only punished Russia with economic sanctions.
He certainly thought that if the only reaction of the West, and in particular of the Europeans, were sanctions, that did not bother him. The sanctions didn't affect the rich billionaires. It rather mocked and caused suffering for the Russian people. Maybe we were too soft back then. It's always a bit easier to rewrite history. In any case, what is certain is that with our reaction, Putin probably thought he could go further.
Indeed, Putin had another plan while he attacked the Donbass, a region in eastern Ukraine. He supported pro-Russian separatists opposed to the Ukrainian government and launched a destabilization campaign using cyber attacks. A war was simmering between Russia and Ukraine.
In Donbass, he tried to do things in a finer way with intelligence training, but more clandestine, so he adapted the method. The big problem compared to 2014 with today is that we thought that suddenly he only used methods that we did not see too much, and we forgot, in fact, he could also use the conventional army.
In a speech at the end of 2014, Putin violently attacked the West, which he accused of being responsible for the crisis in Ukraine. The Russian bear, once again, getting his claws out.
The bear is the master of the forest, and he does not intend to live in another climate. It's not pleasant for him there, so he will never give his forest to anyone. I would like to make that clear.
After his success in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin launched a new war that brought Russia back to the center of the world chessboard. Since 2011 and the Arab Spring revolts, a civil war had been raging in Syria. It pitted the dictator Bashar al-Assad, a historical ally of Russia, against rebel groups and Islamist militias.
All Arab dictators up to that point have fallen. No one thinks that Bashar al-Assad will resist, so in Moscow, we don't think it's possible either.
Barack Obama, the President of the United States, took issue with the Syrian dictator in 2012.
The use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable. And if you make the tragic mistake of using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
In August 2013, Bashar al-Assad crossed the line and used chemical weapons to kill over 1,400 people. But Barack Obama backed down.
In 2013, so there's this case. Obama's line is going to be crossed on the use of gas against civilians. We don't intervene. We let it happen.
Vladimir Putin did not condemn Bashar al-Assad's chemical attacks. He even decided to support him and justified his intervention as the fight against ISIS and terrorism.
No one is really fighting the Islamic State and terrorist organizations in Syria except President Assad's armed forces and Kurdish militias. Putin, he's not a strategist, he's a tactician. He has a vision and he's opportunistic. He sees opportunities, he rushes in, and that's Putin. The policy of weakness since 2011 in Syria has fueled hopes of adopting equally warlike practices by saying that in fact the West is now ashamed to be Democrats. I can do what I want, and basically he's quite right. Vladimir Putin has read all this Arab revolutions and democratization in the street that bring down governments, and I'll show you how to use them, and that finally, I dare to use them. That I have modern weapons, that I also know as a retreat of the Western world.
On September the 30th, 2015, Putin deployed his troops to Syria, in particular his Sukhoi fighter planes. They bombed rebels and the civilian population indiscriminately. The city of Aleppo was completely destroyed.
Destroying a city does not pose a moral problem to Vladimir Putin. Why? Because he simply has done it already. He did it in Grozny, on Russian territory, and Aleppo is just Grozny once again. I would like to remind you that the Russians did not wage war on ISIS. They made it a war on the civilians, with tens of thousands of deaths. To reduce Aleppo was to reduce a city in the hands of Bashar's opponents, and all this is documented.
Abdul is a Syrian photographer. He covered the massacres committed by the Russian army between 2015 and 2018 in eastern Ghouta, a region west of Damascus.
This is of a girl who was trapped and survived. On February 8, 2018, it was a very long day of bombing. The other image is from the same day. It was such a strong strike. So powerful, it destroyed this whole building here. We saw the missile in the sky that was falling, and it was the Russians. If I remember correctly, 35 people died.
Si je me souviens bien, on sort de 35 morts.
Between 2015 and 2018, Russian strikes in Syria killed over 8,000 civilians.
That photo shows a cluster bomb that came from Russia. This is a weapon that had fallen in a residential area in Ghouta.
A cluster bomb is a weapon built with submunitions. Once dropped, it disperses hundreds of explosive charges. An international treaty ratified in 2008 bans its use. Russia, however, is not a signatory. In Syria, on a military field, the Russian army carried out a full-scale exercise.
This is the modernized Russian military equipment on show. It is a real demonstration that we are witnessing. Putin has modernized the Russian military, and he is using all these new weapons in the Syrian theater. For example, the Russian Defense Ministry explained that they had tested more than 200 weapons systems in Syria. The special forces, as well as several tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, gained experience in Syria. Chechens were in Aleppo, the same ones who are now deployed in Ukraine. And as you know, in Moscow, they proposed the use of Syrians to fight in Ukraine.
On a geopolitical level, the intervention was a great success. Russian ally Bashar al-Assad remained in power.
Our goal is achieved. With a brilliant result. Congratulations.
Russia was back. A concert held by a Russian symphonic orchestra in Palmyra, the city martyred by ISIS, was broadcast to the world.
It was very important after the example of Gaddafi, where the leader had been massacred in the street by his population, to establish a counter-symbol that the dictator will not fall, and that Russia can be counted on to maintain this dictator. By supporting Bashar al-Assad, he showed the world, especially in the Middle East, that Russia does not abandon its friends. Second advantage, we settle for the long term in this region, which will bother the Americans. We take our place in the Middle East, so all those who bother the Americans are good to take in the logic of Putin's Russia.
Bolstered by the success of its war in Syria, Russia decided to take on a new continent, Africa.
Russia comes looking to extend its affluence. It comes looking for some rather small but important economic assets for Russia, and particularly political and diplomatic support from all these states that are not democracies.
In October 2019, Vladimir Putin invited African heads of state to the resort city of Sochi by the Black Sea for the first ever Russia-Africa summit.
I welcome all participants here in Sochi to the summit devoted to cooperation between Russia and African states.
This first edition was a huge success. Out of 54 African countries, more than 40 heads of state answered Putin's call. Among them, Faustin Archange Touadéra, the president of the Central African Republic.
Dear colleagues, I am very happy to see you in Russia. Indeed, Russia is providing the Central African Republic with enormous assistance in the military field. We intend to train the military for the Central African Armed Forces, modernize the FACA, and train the gendarmes and police.
The Central African Republic, a former French colony, had long been the embodiment of Franc-Afrique, but Paris had gradually lost its influence there. The Russians took the opportunity to interfere in the governance of the country. So much so that today in Bangui, the capital, demonstrations are stirring in the streets. While the whole planet has rallied behind Ukraine, here things are seen a little differently.
We are here to give our unwavering support to Russia in this war. We are obliged from now on. Russia is going through a difficult moment, and we must give our moral support.
These demonstrators were paid around €5. It's not very hard to convince them, as Russia has already won over the hearts and minds of the Central African Republic. On this Friday afternoon in Bangui, the stands of the municipal stadium were buzzing. The happy crowd had not come to cheer for football. The 20,000 spectators were here to attend the premiere of a feature film, a blockbuster shot in their country called Tourist. Despite the profusion of special effects, this film does not come from a Hollywood studio. It is a Russian production. The plot is simple. The Central African president is threatened by dangerous rebels.
It's obvious that the rebels are trying to close in on the capital and establish a blockade.
On one side are the bad guys, the rebels helped by duplicitous advisors who we can assume are French.
But a small victory plus 1,000 Cadian mercenaries, I think that would be quite enough.
On the other side, the good guys, the brave Russian instructors who support the Central African military.
You're going to teach them basic tactics, combat methods, and more specifically, to teach local fighters how to use a machine gun.
Far from accusations of abuse, murder and rape, Russian mercenaries are presented here in their best light.
Then, don't drink, don't rush civilians, don't have sex with anyone who is local, even the fauna and flora.
Like any blockbuster, Tourist has a happy ending. The Russians and Central Africans managed to defeat the rebels and restore peace to the country.
Today, in the Central African Republic, the inauguration of President Faustin-Archange Touadéra is taking place. The elections could be held freely thanks to the participation of a Russian instructor. In the capital of the country, Bangui, peace reigns, thanks to Russia.
This propaganda masterpiece was produced by a Russian company called Aurum. However, Russia doesn't only broadcast action films. The Kremlin's misinformation specialists are also targeting children. In the dark classrooms of the Central African Republic, little boys and girls can watch cartoons. In this one, a brave lion is attacked by a pack of devious hyenas. Despite his courage, he has to call on a big bear who quickly leaves his icy forest and crosses the deserts to help his African friend.
Il faut établir la paix, sinon rien ne pourra aider.
This film is produced by the company Invest. Like Aurum, this company belongs to a mysterious man, Evgeny Prigozhin.
He is directly linked to Vladimir Putin. There are photos that prove that they know each other, even though they have not officially worked together. He is known as the Kremlin's chef.
This wealthy businessman received this nickname not for his culinary talents, but for his skill for obtaining lucrative public contracts to supply the army and the Kremlin, even if Vladimir Putin does not seem to know him.
All my chefs are employees of the State Security Service. These are people who are military, and I have no other cooks. I would like to make it clear and not to return to this subject.
Putin avoids association with this elusive businessman mainly because Evgeny Prigozhin is the boss of an army of mercenaries, the Wagner Group.
They are former Russian intelligence, former Russian special forces, who have grouped together to do operations that are not under the Russian banner, but in Russia's interest. In reality today, the Wagners are an instrument of Russia's power, so they can project wherever they feel they need to defend their interests without wanting to recognize that the sovereign troops of Russia are present.
Since 2018, several thousand men have arrived in the Central African Republic, officially to train the armed forces, but in reality, they will fight against the rebels to keep the president in power.
There is an offer of Russian security in the form of mercenaries, notably from the Wagner Group, who are quite ready to play the role that France played in the 60s and 70s of protecting African dictators.
In exchange for the help of Wagner's mercenaries, Russia can happily help itself to the country's wealth.
It's a mechanic of predation. Everything that brings something to Russia's safe is also good to take. On the African continent, they support regimes that are favorable to Russia, and they try to keep or obtain new contracts on natural resources, especially diamonds. In fact, they are plundering the resources of African countries.
To defend Russian interests, the Kremlin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has already deployed his mercenaries in Syria, Libya, Venezuela and Mali. Today they are arriving by the hundreds in Ukraine. The Wagner Group fighters are sent to the field with a very specific mission: to track down and kill President Zelenskyy. At a time when Putin's army is besieging and bombing major Ukrainian cities, he is hardening his regime with the aim of purifying Russian society.
Any people, and especially the Russian people, are able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors, and spit out the latter like a gnat.
How much longer will warlord Vladimir Putin manage to stay in power?
Vladimir Putin has made a monumental mistake. He thinks he is destroying the Ukrainian state, but in reality it is his own state that he is destroying. Since Putin is not going to stay in power for much longer. All the people who are around him owe everything to Vladimir Putin, including their money. So I don't think they will kill their golden calf. On the other hand, let millions of Soviets take to the streets to bring an end to the war and the flenter, sinister black plastic bags arriving to villages with corpses of dead Russian children. The Russian people have spirit. Maybe the Russian people will make the Kremlin understand that it can't go on like this.
Will Ukraine be Vladimir Putin's final war? With thousands of deaths already, it's damaging Russia's fate for the long term.